Our next speaker, I have the pleasure and the honor to invite Professor Dr. Andrew Bennett, from the Department of Government, Georgetown University. Professor Bennett is teaching at Georgetown University since 1990, including courses on international relations, the U.S. foreign policy process, and qualitative research methods. He also worked in the U.S. Department of Defense and the U.S. Senate and advised several presidential campaigns on foreign policy. His research is focused on decision-making and the use of force, civil and ethnic conflict, alliance burden sharing, the making of U.S. foreign policy, political psychology, and case study research methods. Professor Bennett is also the president of the Consortium on Qualitative Research Methods. Currently he is writing a book on why some of the proponents of intervention in Iraq have changed their mind and others have not, which will provide insight into the general questions how and under what condition political actors recognize error, update their expectation, and either displace blame or accept responsibility for policies that produce a bad outcome. I'm sure we will all read this book. Thank you very much. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, it's a privilege to be here to speak. I was fortunate enough to be a student of Joe Nye at Harvard University when he started to popularize the notion of soft power, and then I also, as you mentioned, I worked with him at the Defense Department in the mid-1990s. But today I'm going to talk about soft power and the struggle against terrorism. I suspect many of you recognize this picture, what it's referring to. This is a demonstration in Pakistan against the violence against Malala Yousafzai, who was a very young schoolgirl who spoke out on behalf of the need for schoolgirls in Pakistan and elsewhere to have a right to education and access to education. And she was brutally attacked and shot on a school bus and is still recuperating from that. But this was a signal event that really brought out a lot of opposition to the radical Islamists in Pakistan and elsewhere, and it became a rallying point for some of the more moderate elements of Islam. So this, I think, illustrates that really the key struggle is not the West against Islam or other religions against Islam. It's a struggle within Islam between the moderates who have deep religious values but also a moderate interpretation of the Quran versus radicals who've distorted the religious teachings of Islam for their own purposes. Soft power is a key instrument in this struggle. Soft power, I'm sure it's been defined many times in the course of this conference. I wasn't able to come to some of the earlier panels as I was traveling, but soft power is to get other actors to want what you want rather than using carrots or sticks or coercion or rewards to get them to do what you want. So soft power has a deeper, more lasting effect, and here soft power has to be have the goal of helping the moderates to win this argument within Islam. Winning the support of ordinary people is really critical to this process. There are elites on each side of this argument between the radicals and the moderates. In the struggle against terrorism, the help of ordinary citizens to call attention to terrorists among their midst, to provide information in the war on terrorism is critical to success. Soft power, because it deals so much and so intimately with the role of ideas, it really has to be tailored to the local politics and local sense of history. And so I could talk about many different countries and the different kinds or themes of soft power that might be used in those countries in the struggle against terrorism. I'm going to focus today on the case of Pakistan. So there are lots of opportunities to win support and to strengthen the moderates in Pakistan using soft power, and I don't think we're fully making use of these. I mentioned the attack on Malala Yousafzai. This was widely condemned among even elements of the Pakistani government and society that had not previously spoken out so strongly against some things that the Taliban had done. The Chief of Staff of the Army, Kayani, spoke against it very strongly. Even the charitable wing of Lashkar-e-Taiba, which is a radical Islamic group in Pakistan that's been perpetrating attacks in India, even they spoke out against this attack on Yousafzai. So this creates an opening for an argument that we can definitely win against the radicals. In the last 6 weeks, you may have seen more than a dozen vaccination workers have been assassinated in Pakistan. This creates another argument that we should clearly be winning against the radicals. What happened here was that not just in Pakistan but elsewhere in Nigeria, some, for their own purposes, started rumors that these vaccinations were a secret plot to create infertility among Muslims. I mean, this is just such a wild conspiracy theory. It should be extremely easy to disprove and to have, people demonstrating in public that they're more than happy to take the vaccine, which actually it's not even an injection. It's a drop that you can take orally. It should be easy to talk about the history of polio in the world and in the United States. We've had a president, Roosevelt, who was a victim of polio. This should be a no-brainer. We should be able to win this argument by simply providing factual information. Pakistan is one of the 4 countries that still has cases of polio. And, we should talk about the history of eradicating smallpox, which was a similar campaign. And we can put it in a positive light that Pakistan can do its part to help eradicate this disease worldwide. So that should be an easy one to win. We've already had local Muslim scholars and UNICEF, even before the recent assassinations, had been mobilizing to try to get this message across. And so, as is so critical in the use of soft power, we have to have local allies with local networks and credibility and legitimacy. As Mark Lagon mentioned, those are critical to soft power. And we have this here, and this is, again, a fight we should be winning, although recently, the vaccination campaign was put on hold, at least temporarily, to rethink and provide security for vaccination workers. But one of the problems here was also one of our own doing. When we went after bin Laden in the intelligence effort to find out where he was and if that was really him in Abbottabad, we used a Pakistani doctor who was ostensibly doing a vaccination campaign against hepatitis B to try to collect DNA evidence about whether it was really Osama bin Laden in the compound. It failed. It did not provide any useful intelligence, but when it was revealed later, it sort of discredited other vaccination campaigns throughout Pakistan. So this was partly a problem of our own making, but I think it's one that we can recover from with the right kind of campaign in engaging local people with legitimacy. Another argument we should really be winning is about terrorist attacks on fellow Muslims. If you go back to the conflict in Iraq, there was one very revealing moment in 2006 when we captured some documents, and one of these documents was a letter from Ayman al-Zawahiri, who was then the #2 al-Qaeda leader. Now he's the #1 since Osama bin Laden has been killed. He was writing a letter to Abu Musab al-Zarqawi, who was the #1 head of al-Qaeda in Iraq. And in this letter, one, it showed that the al-Qaeda was focused very much on the public relations front, because Zawahiri argued that at least half the battle is in the media. But two, it also showed some splits between these two groups. And Zawahiri was criticizing Zarqawi for the attacks on the Shia, the violent attacks on the Shia and on Muslim on mosques in Iraq, because he was worried that this was alienating fellow Muslims. Obviously, Shia and Sunni are two different groups within Islam, and with many theological and other disagreements. And Zawahiri, wasn't too worried about, in some respects, he saw the Shia as apostates, as a threat to the legitimate religious views of Sunnis. But even he felt that attacking them in their mosque and killing them was a step too far. And when Al-Qaeda tells you you're being too violent, you know you've gone too far, right? But this also illustrated, how this is an issue on which they're vulnerable. Many terrorist attacks have killed Muslims. In fact, more Muslims have been killed since 9/11 than Westerners in the war on terrorism. And just today in the newspapers we have news of the most deadly attack in some time in Pakistan, where 81 Shiites were killed in Pakistan. And this should be something that it's clearly against the precepts of Islam, the killing of innocents and the killing of fellow Muslims. This is an issue we should be using to discredit the Taliban, to discredit Al-Qaeda and other radicals. So that's another argument that we should clearly be winning. The problem, as was mentioned earlier, is we're not clearly winning this argument as we should be. One of the most recent and comprehensive polls of public opinion in Pakistan last summer by the Pew Foundation found that 74% of Pakistanis view the United States as an enemy. This is after years of cooperation on some issues and lots of American aid. In fact, the U.S. is as unpopular in Pakistan as India, and if you know anything about Pakistani relations with India, that's saying a lot, and it's not saying anything good about our relations with Pakistan. Obama is now as unpopular as Bush in this poll. You can see somebody mentioned the drone strikes in the last session. Clearly that's a key source of contention that's dragging down the popularity and legitimacy of the United States in Pakistan. It's surprising that even 17% there support the drone strikes. But still, there is at least some good news in this poll, and that is that strong majorities still oppose Al-Qaeda and oppose the Taliban. So we've got a lot of work to do here, but just because Pakistanis are upset at the U.S., it doesn't mean that they're automatically sympathetic to Al-Qaeda or the Taliban. So why aren't we doing better, right? We've got what should be easily winnable arguments. We've got extreme violence against innocents by the other side that goes contrary to all the precepts of Islam or any other religion of the world, and yet we're not doing better. A good part of the problem, and this was mentioned in the last panel, is if your hard power campaign, drone strikes, is doing one thing, then it's hard for the soft power campaign to counteract that image. And so clearly the drone strikes have been increased in the Obama administration. We've had, I think, 7 in the last 10 days. But there doesn't seem to be any clear idea or concept about, when or under what circumstances might we be tailoring back these drone strikes, where are we going to start drawing the line between going after really high-level people like Zawahiri, should we get information on his location, versus taking out more mid-level commanders where it's not as clear that the value added in terms of hurting Al-Qaeda's operations or the Taliban operations outweighs the outrage and the damage to U.S. legitimacy in engaging in drone strike tactics. So this is a debate that's we need to be having. I think of itself the drone strikes may taper off as the U.S. pulls back from Afghanistan, but there's a possibility that the U.S. will rely on drone strikes even more to compensate for the absence of U.S. Forces or at least the decrease of U.S. forces in Afghanistan. We don't know yet if the U.S. is going to go to 0 or some other number. But as long as that's continuing, certainly at the scale that it has been, it's going to be very hard for soft power to make much headway. But that's not the only issue, and it's not the easiest one to move on. One of the other astonishing things about U.S. relations with Pakistan is that from the moments after 9/11 even till now, restrictions on free trade have been a big issue, and we haven't been able to resolve it. The textile trade employs a huge number of Pakistanis, and this was, and yet we have a quota, we have a limitation on textile imports to the U.S. from Pakistan, and this was brought up soon after 9/11. It seemed like an obvious way for the U.S. to improve its relations with Pakistan and to build goodwill in the countryside, including in the northern territories of Pakistan. But because of domestic politics in the United States, even though there's not a huge textile industry anymore in the United States, it's been long since offshore to many other countries. Even though that was the case, there were still just enough residual commercial interests in the textile trade that they trumped in this case what should have been an obvious policy change for the United States. So that's an area where we still can move on, and it's a lot easier to deal with than trying to change the policy on drone strikes. There's some other areas too of bringing more foreign students from Pakistan and the United States. We have now about 5,000 Pakistani students a year who study in the U.S. There's about twice that number who study in Britain. There was, in general, after 9/11, the number of foreign students in the U.S. dropped for some period of time because of increased restrictions, security restrictions after 9/11. I think that situation has improved. I'm not sure it ever affected Pakistan. But it's not just a question of not having restrictions on students. It's a question of providing positive inducements and opportunities for students to come study in the United States and then go back to their home countries with a much fuller and more positive view of the United States. So if we're going to have a more effective soft power campaign against terrorism in Pakistan, what's the message? Part of the message is that the particular strain of Islam, it's really even hard to call it a strain of Islam because it's so radical, the particular set of views that Al-Qaeda is pushing is really an alien ideology to Pakistan. It's alien to most of the Muslims around the world. It's not a homegrown movement. It hasn't produced a lot of converts in Pakistan, even though it's got perhaps some sympathizers. So we need to start creating a bigger wedge there. We also have to point out how it's really a misreading of the Quran and key issues like the killing of innocents and of fellow Muslims. And this is something where a number of clerics have already made this point, but it needs to be made yet again and forcefully. We have to note that Al-Qaeda's goal of a caliphate is really a threat to Pakistan's national identity. And we need to point out that the radicals are ignorant and inhumane on issues like vaccine and the education of girls. Now this last one, I mean, most of these are, I think, a pretty easy sell in Pakistan. The last one on the role of women and girls in Pakistani society, that's a tougher sell. But this is not one that we can avoid. It's critical to creating broader human rights in Pakistan and, of course, Afghanistan as well. And it's an area where we shouldn't shy away from making these arguments, even if we know this will be a more uphill argument against traditional values in Pakistan and some other countries. But it's an argument that we need to win and we need to engage it. Also, we need to just get out the facts. There's a long-running set of debates in U.S. public diplomacy about Voice of America and other efforts to put out messages that are more favorable to the United States. Radio Sawa has been going on in the Islamic world, but it's tried to do this through, tried to first build up a listener base by music with only a light dose of heavier information. I think we just need to get information out there, and the hook, the buy-in is information that people can use in their daily lives, whether it's accurate weather reports or crop reports or other things, or information on sanitation or polio or other diseases. And then with that, just accurate news about what's going on in the world. We don't have to doctor the story to win the argument. So I think we need to, in our message, just get out news that's reliable, that people can see in their daily lives is accurate, and build up our legitimacy that way, rather than having too heavy-handed a message or trying to get them to listen in through some other means. The messengers right now, the U.S. Is so far down in its credibility and legitimacy in Pakistan that it's hard for the U.S., even our leaders, directly to carry some of these messages. So often we'll have to be working with and through others, locals, until we can start to build up more credibility through things like providing accurate information and making convincing arguments about everything from polio to the inappropriateness of killing innocents. Sort of the low point of this was in the Bush administration. They decided they recognized the need for reaching out to the Islamic world, but they appointed Karen Hughes, who was a key Bush advisor. A lot of people pointed out this was as if the Islamic world decided they needed an ambassador to the United States to get across their view of the world, and they had appointed, you know, a woman in full burqa who didn't speak a word of English, right? So you need to have messengers here that understand the culture, speak the language often, and can and know enough about the culture to know which messages are going to resonate. So a lot of this is more providing local moderates who do exist, who are out there, providing them with information, and we can provide things like focus group testing of what messages resonate, but they'll also, the locals have a sense of that, but providing with them with information so they can be the messengers and win the argument. Celebrities can play a role here too. Again, it's a question of finding people who have a local standing and also share more values that we share about fighting against terrorism. We now have a Center for Strategic Counterterrorism Communications in the State Department, established in 2010 under Tara Sonnenschein, who I guess has spoken to this conference. It's got really too low a profile. If you look for them online, you won't get a website of their own in the first page or two. This is a problem, right? So yes, we need to be behind the scenes a little bit, but we can't be so far behind the scenes that you can't even find out what this office, easily find out what they're up to, right? They should be having an effective website that puts out messages and information and links to other things, mostly links to other things that are already out there that provide good information, good arguments for the moderates to carry into their communities. The medium has to be mostly radio. Too many of our efforts have been on the internet, and that's not how people in northern Pakistan get their news. I don't think it's a question of creating our own radio station, because inevitably, no matter how objective or truth-oriented it is, if it's known to be an American station, it's going to be discredited. So it's more a question of getting out information to people who already have radio stations and make it easier for them to win the arguments against the radicals. This is why I mentioned Radio Sawa and others. I think have been a mixed success at best, and I don't think that's the model, especially for Pakistan. So again, providing information. You know, we just had a $2 billion presidential campaign. We've got people who are very talented at figuring out messages, at narrow casting, and knowing what themes work, and we need to use some of those talents for finding out the messages that resonate with this very different culture in Pakistan. So the bottom line is, you know, this is an argument the moderates in the West can win, right? There's a lot of common view here. We need to better coordinate hard and soft power, and as I said, until we do something different with the drones, it's going to be hard for any of that, even if we were doing it perfectly, to have much effect in Pakistan. So that's going to have to change as well, but if that changed without a soft power campaign of the type I'm talking about, that would also not be very effective. We need to empower the moderates and provide them with what we can best provide them with, information. And we need to find themes that resonate with ordinary Pakistanis. So this, you know, the bad news is we're not winning this argument that we could easily win. The good news is I think it is still winnable if we do the right things. So let me stop there and invite your questions and comments. Thank you.
Very much for the excellent presentation.
Good morning. My name is Ari Fodeman. I'm a psych student at American University, and I study de-radicalization.
Ah, good.
Certainly, as you have said, there is a lot potentially to be said for the debate over, you know, what Islam is, what's a true or fair reading of the Quran, and so forth.
Right.
But with that in mind, perhaps I'm misremembering, hopefully you can correct me if otherwise, but is it not true that within the Quran there are lines, much like within the Old Testament, which do state that blasphemers and apostates, etc., should be killed?
Yeah. Yeah, so like any good religious text that hangs around for a long time, there are lots of different passages that you could read different ways. And so I'm saying we need to get our reading out there, right? And however you characterize, blasphemers or infidels, it's pretty hard to use that to be shooting young schoolgirls in the face, right? It's pretty hard to be using that to be killing, to be destroying mosques, even if it's mosques of Shiites, right? And there are plenty of people on both the Sunni and the Shiite side of that you can get together and agree on that theological point, right? So yeah, there's lots of religious readings of any religious text, but we need to make sure that the one that we think makes sense and that many moderate Muslims make sense is the one that dominates the dialogue.
We've heard a lot of criticism during this conference of the drone strikes and the damage it's doing to the U.S. image. Clearly, that's the Obama administration's method of choice for fighting al-Qaeda. What do you think would be a better alternative? Should it be purely a soft power approach? It seems like any hard power approach will probably result in civilians being killed.
Yeah.
So what do you think would be a better alternative?
Yeah, so I don't think we're going to get to zero on the drone strikes anytime soon, just as a pragmatic, practical matter. I'm not sure we should. I mean, if I knew where Zawahiri was, I would be inclined to say, yeah, let's use a drone if that's what it takes to take him out. But what I'm saying is, we have to be very aware of the trade-offs, and in some few cases, there will be a very important high-value added target where it's either Zawahiri or somebody who's really critical to the functional operation of the Taliban in Afghanistan, or critical to their attacks on American soldiers, where, yes, we're going to make one decision there. But there's a lot of other ones it's hard for me to imagine, and I don't know all the details of every target they're going after. But you have to weigh that against the opposition that it creates. The collateral damage is a euphemistic word for killing other people who just happen to be next to the person you're going after, and the fact that it doesn't necessarily degrade the operational capacity of the other side very much, right? Because there will be another commander, perhaps even more radical, who's just going to step into those shoes. It was important to get Osama bin Laden for symbolic reasons, but he was not the most important person operationally in Al-Qaeda, and Al-Qaeda isn't necessarily even the most important group operationally that we need to be worried about, right? So we have the other problem here that's been evident for a long time is, if you said to yourself, which country is more important, not that we get to choose which country is going to be in a bad situation, but between Afghanistan and Pakistan, there's no question that Pakistan is far more important to the world and to the United States, right? It's 4 or 5 times the population. It's got nuclear weapons. That's where the Taliban are. That's where Al-Qaeda is. And we have so much, because we have an operational need in Afghanistan, we have so much focused on Afghanistan because we're there, that we have had many policies that have made the problem far worse in Pakistan. And that's not the right choice. I mean, I understand how that choice got made because we're trying to protect our troops in Afghanistan, as we should. But we need to weigh those trade-offs, and we haven't always weighed those correctly. So I don't think we can get to zero on drones, but I think we need to start drawing the line differently. And we need to have an articulated policy about what the standards are and what the process is we're going to go through in making these decisions. Brennan, who's moving from the NSC to head up the CIA, I think is a smart guy, and he's been at the center of these debates. Sometimes he's been wrong-footed and said the wrong things, like implying that there had been zero, collateral casualties to the drone strikes. That's clearly not true, right? But I think he and others need to start moving in the direction of saying, look, the goal of the drone strikes is to finish the drone strikes, right? The goal should be get to zero. Nobody should disagree on that. We can disagree on how fast we can get there or what conditions, but that should be the goal, right? If we haven't ended the drone strikes, we're not winning the war on terrorism.
Thank you. My name is Ashot, Tier 1 Center for Democracy and Peace. We are talking about cultural diplomacy, and my question would be, could you bring like 2 examples of cultural specific benefits from Iran and Russia for the United States to go deeper and, well, have more influence in democratization process with these two countries? So two specifics of local cultures, both Iran and Russia, please.
Yeah. Well, I personally know a lot more about Russia than Iran because it was one of my areas I've worked on in some of my research. And I just, in fact, I know the current U.S. ambassador he was mentioned, Mike McFall, in the previous talk for some 20 years now. And he's very attuned to these issues. He's the person who did the reset when he was at the National Security Council, and now he's over there dealing with these issues every day. So, these are two very different countries. In Russia, you do have a long tradition of people who are more Western-oriented, right, and who are attuned to democracy. They're a bit beleaguered right now by the government, but there is a set of values there that we can build on and encourage, and still a moderately free press, that we can work with. And so I think that's a basis to start building. But it's very difficult right now with bloggers being arrested on trumped-up charges and so on and so forth. The debate we're having right now about where we instituted sanctions on a number of Russian leaders over the Magnitsky case, and they've retaliated now by, cutting off adoptions to the U.S. Again, this is an argument I think we are winning, right? It just seems so utterly inhumane to be responding to the Magnitsky case by hurting orphans. I mean, that's not a winning argument for Putin, I don't think, right? And I think eventually they're going to recognize that. So I think there are a lot of things we can do, and we are doing to sort of win those arguments in Russia. Again, Iran, I wouldn't presume to be an expert on that, and as I said, it has to be local knowledge, and I'm not, so I wouldn't venture to say much about that.
I'm Pierre Garlin from Paris. I'd like to go back to drones.
Yeah.
Serious legal scholars like David Cole argue that using drones is just illegal.
Mm-hmm.
So how can you promote the rule of law by breaking the law?
Yeah.
US law and international law.
Yeah.
That's the first point. The second point is countries react towards the United States in terms of their history of the relationship with the US. So the history of Iran with the US is a history of US attacks on Iran,
mm-hmm.
not Iranian attacks on the United States. So the regime is ugly. But even democracy activists in Iran, like Shirin Ebadi, argue that the US should not support the pro-democracy movements because it kills them. Because the history of the connection of the US in Iran, because the US is the attacker in the relationship with Iran. So how can the US then teach lessons when it has this loaded history? And there are many cases in which all the stuff you were describing, which is valuable, cannot be done because of the history of the US. And its continuing history. The fact that in Pakistan there are many problems, many Islamists and so on, totally agree with this, but the history of US involvement in Pakistan is very tangled. It's mixed, it's not the same as Iran. And in some cases, some countries cannot intervene culturally because of their history. It's like, the French presuming to teach the Algerians to get their act together. They cannot do it because of their history.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I take the first point about international law very seriously, but of course it's also against international law to perpetrate terrorism, right? So we have two things here, and as is often the case, since international law is not universally enforced, we have to do some of the enforcing ourselves, and sometimes we're going to have to choose which violation of the law is more offensive to us, right?
Targeted assassinations are illegal in American law as well.
They are by executive order, which is different from a law. It's so that is a legal point of issue that's that's disputed. On your second point, I think it's also a point very well taken, and of course in the case of Pakistan, there's a long history here too, where Pakistanis feel that the U.S. deserted them after we built up the Mujahideen to fight against the Soviets, and then we quickly pulled out, and not only pulled out, but we cut off assistance and other things over their nuclear program. And then later, We sold them F-16 jets. We took their money, and then we didn't deliver the jets because we were sanctioning them over their nuclear program, right? So they also feel there's a history where the U.S. has gone back and forth and been inconsistent, and that's why I say I agree with you that we can't be directly, up front. We won't be credible with American leaders making these, messages in public, but we have to work through other intermediaries. On the case of Iran, I'd have to say, there have been attacks in both directions. I mean, I remember very well the taking of U.S. diplomats hostage in Iran. So, but I think the Obama administration was aware of the point that you raised. Mark Lagon previously was criticizing a little bit for not standing more strong with the demonstrators, but I think the point that Obama was worried about was that, just as you say, being too clearly, speaking out might have actually discredited some of the demonstrators within the Iranian political context. So yes, we have to be very aware of where we are viewed so negatively that even if the message itself might appeal, we're not the right messenger, and I think that's critical to making soft power work. I think we need to get to the point with Pakistan, which is far off right now, where we ourselves can be a credible messenger, but we're starting at such a low base of credibility. We're going to have a lot of work to do before we can do that.
If I allow me, I would like just say something. I think U.S. also for the visibility and having a better image in Pakistan can work more closely with other organizations.
Yes.
Or EU, for example.
Yes, absolutely.
Ashton was one of the person who tend to do that with U.S. and, for example, UNESCO, the last one, the last example which is in my mind is Malala project, which was launched months ago in Paris. With the support of the president of Pakistan, and Hillary Clinton was participating via Bennett conference and saying that she is totally agreeing on this Malala project, which is helping and want to develop the education for girls in Pakistan. And I think this is really the soft power, and this was really good because the Pakistani president was very happy that Hillary Clinton has this statement right there in front of all these huge and important organizations like UNESCO, EU, Gordon Brown was there, the United Nations Space Envoy envoy for education. And this kind of project has to be, very well promoted for US here, for example, and also in all these NGOs, the civil society who is working with Pakistan here, for example, can give a better image, because there is not a lot of people who knows that US is also involved on that, and I think it's going to be better for here, especially here, because in Pakistan they know, but not in US, because I tried to read a little bit, there's nothing on it. This is a good example. No, absolutely. The more that we can work through NGOs, international organizations, the more we can work as a coalition of many other countries, including Islamic countries and Islamic leaders, the more powerful. If you notice that first slide that I showed, all the people in the background were women, right? And this is why I say, even though the argument for women's equality and rights is a tough one to make in these traditional cultures, it's one we have to make. And if we're not making it, who's going to make that argument, right? So I think you're absolutely right. Thank you very much. Please join me.
Thank you.